I had just finished putting the final touches on my makeup when I heard a voice from upstairs. "Emily, can you help me?" Ethan called, his voice unusually strained. At first, I didn't think much of it. Ethan was always capable of handling things on his own, but something about the way he said my name caught my attention. It was like he was in trouble or needed help more than usual. Curious, I made my way upstairs. As I approached his room, I heard him muttering under his breath. When I entered, I found him standing in front of the mirror, frowning, struggling with his belt. His pants were sagging, and he was holding them up with one hand while trying to fix the buckle with the other. "What's going on, Ethan?" I asked, standing by the door, watching him as he continued his battle with the belt. "This stupid belt," he said, frustration clearly written on his face. "It's jammed, and of all times, we're supposed to leave for that party soon. I can't get it to work." I hesitated for a moment. Ethan was usually so self-sufficient, but seeing him so flustered made me step forward without thinking. "Let me try," I said gently, walking over to him. He handed the belt to me, and I grabbed the buckle, trying to unjam the leather strap. Sometimes it's just a little tug that fixes these things. And just as I said that, the buckle came loose, and before either of us could react, his pants slid all the way down. For a moment, everything froze. I didn't know where to look, but my eyes instinctively drifted down. Before I could stop myself, I quickly turned my head away, and I could feel my face turning a deep shade of red. Ethan's face was as red as mine, and he was looking anywhere but at me. Sorry," I mumbled, my voice shaking as I covered my mouth with my hand. I wanted to apologize, but I had no idea what to say. This was completely unintentional, but it felt like we both just stumbled into this moment with no way out. Ethan broke the silence with an awkward chuckle. "Guess we didn't save the pants," he said, trying to joke, but it was clear that we were both embarrassed. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that makes you feel like you can't move or breathe. I took a few steps back, my heart racing. What was I supposed to do now? I think you might need to find another belt." I managed to mumble, my voice trembling. I couldn't even look at him. Ethan quickly yanked his pants back up, tossing the belt aside, clearly embarrassed. "All right, no big deal. I'll figure it out," he said, though his voice betrayed him, a little tense, like he wasn't sure if he was more embarrassed or frustrated. Feeling the awkward tension, I turned toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. "I'll finish getting ready in my room," I said quickly, almost rushing out of the room before I could even hear his response. Once I was in the hallway, I leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. What just happened? My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't stop the heat on my face. I quickly moved to my room, trying to ignore the chaos swirling in my mind, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking as I tried to fix my makeup, but I couldn't seem to steady myself. Every time I thought about Ethan's expression, my heart would race again. Why couldn't I just let it go? It was just an accident. But it didn't feel like just an accident. It felt like something more, something that I didn't know how to handle. I jumped when I heard David's voice from downstairs. "Emily, you ready? We're going to be late," he called up. "I'm coming," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I took a deep breath and wiped my hands on my pants, trying to calm myself down. Tonight, I had to act like nothing had happened. I had to forget about what had just occurred with Ethan. By the time I made it downstairs, Ethan was already dressed. He had found a new belt, and was fixing his tie, though his movements were quick, almost jerky, as if he was trying to ignore what had just happened. For a moment our eyes met. His face was still a little flushed, and he quickly looked away, not saying anything. The awkwardness lingered between us. David, completely oblivious, smiled and grabbed his car keys. "All right, you two ready?" he asked cheerfully. "Yeah," I answered, trying to make my voice sound normal. Ethan nodded quietly and headed toward the door, not saying much. I could feel the tension in the air, but David seemed to miss it entirely. We all piled into the car, and David hummed a song as he drove. As we sat in the back, my mind raced. Just sitting next to Ethan felt suffocating. I had to act like everything was fine, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Why was it so hard to forget? The drive to the party was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between Ethan and me. It was like that brief moment had changed everything, even though nothing had really happened. By the time we got home from the party, it was well past midnight. David went straight to the bathroom to shower, then headed to bed. His routine was comforting in its predictability, the same every time. But for me, things were far from predictable. I couldn't sleep. The room felt too quiet, too still, as I sat in front of the mirror, wiping off my makeup. My thoughts were racing, and I could feel the anxiety in my chest. The chaos from earlier in the evening hadn't calmed down. David had been everything I needed after my first marriage fell apart. He was kind, stable, and patient. He gave me trust and affection. My first marriage had been a nightmare lack of love, constant disappointment, and unrest. But with David, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We were rebuilding together. But Ethan was different now. The shy, distant college freshman I had met years ago was gone. In his place was a confident, striking man, full of charisma. He had grown into someone who was hard to ignore. His charm, the way he carried himself, felt dangerous in a way I hadn't anticipated. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. What had happened earlier that night? Why did my heart race every time I thought about it? It was just an accident, right? I could feel the guilt rising in my chest. I had to move past it. It was just one of those weird, embarrassing moments. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy to forget. The next morning, the atmosphere felt different. I woke up early, hoping the strange tension from the previous night would have faded away. But as I made my way downstairs, I saw Ethan in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. He seemed focused on the task at hand, his back to me as I entered. There was no sign of the usual casual banter we shared. No good morning or playful remarks. I hesitated, standing in the doorway for a moment. I didn't know what to say, how to approach him. The awkwardness was still there, lingering in the space between us. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said quietly, trying to sound casual. "That smells good." Ethan turned around slowly, his expression guarded. His eyes met mine, but he quickly looked away, focusing back on the pancakes. "Morning," he muttered, voice low and distant. I couldn't help but feel a pang in my chest. This wasn't the Ethan I knew. We had always had a playful dynamic, joking around, teasing each other, but now it felt like everything had shifted. What had happened between us? I moved toward the counter, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee, trying to act normal, though my hands were still trembling. "How's the pancakes coming?" I asked, trying to force some lightness into my voice. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, it was short. They're fine. He flipped another pancake, avoiding my gaze. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the heat of the liquid burn my throat, but it did nothing to calm the unease swirling in my stomach. I kept stealing glances at Ethan, trying to gauge what he was thinking, but it was impossible to read him now. He had always been easy to talk to, easy to understand, but now he seemed like a different person. The lightness was gone, replaced by something more guarded, more distant. I sighed, setting my cup down on the counter. "Look, Ethan, about last night," I began, but he interrupted me before I could continue. "It's fine," he said quickly, turning away to grab a spatula. His voice was even, but I could hear the slight edge to it. "No big deal. Let's just forget it." I could feel the lump forming in my throat. Forget it? How could I just forget what had happened? The image of his embarrassed face flashed in my mind, and I felt my stomach tighten. But it wasn't just that, was it? It wasn't just an accident. It was the way it had made me feel, the way my heart had skipped a beat when he was standing there. I couldn't get rid of the image of him, half-dressed, his pants falling down. It wasn't just awkward. It was something else entirely. I didn't know how to say that to him without it sounding ridiculous, so I stayed quiet. Instead, I picked up a plate, focusing on anything other than the conversation that felt like it was hanging in the air, unspoken and unresolved. I needed to get my bearings, to figure out what to do next. Ethan finished cooking the pancakes, setting a plate down in front of me. "There," he said, his tone almost flat. "You should eat before it gets cold." "Thanks," I muttered, not meeting his eyes as I picked up my fork. The silence between us felt like it was stretching out longer than it should, and I could tell he was struggling to break it, just as much as I was. I couldn't ignore the tension anymore. I needed to address it, but I didn't know how. Just then, David walked in, his usual easygoing smile lighting up his face. "Morning," he greeted, stepping into the kitchen like he hadn't noticed a thing. He grabbed a mug and filled it with coffee, blissfully unaware of the heavy atmosphere. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight. Ethan gave a brief nod in David's direction, but didn't say anything. David, as always, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of discomfort that had settled between us. He went on with his morning routine, talking about a meeting he had scheduled for the afternoon. I felt a pang of guilt. Why couldn't I just be normal around Ethan? Why was I letting something so simple affect me so much? I tried to focus on my food, taking a few bites, but my mind kept drifting. Every now and then, I would glance up at Ethan, catching him looking at me before quickly looking away. It was almost like we were avoiding each other on purpose, but I didn't understand why. After breakfast, we went our separate ways. David headed out for work, and I found myself alone in the living room, staring out the window. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, but I was a mess inside. I felt like I was unraveling. The doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart raced as I opened the door to find Ethan standing on the other side, looking more composed than I felt. "Hey," he said, his voice calmer than I expected. "I was wondering if you wanted to go out for a walk or something." I blinked, caught off guard by the offer. A walk? What did he mean by that? Was this an attempt to make things less awkward between us? Sure," I said, my voice faltering. I didn't know what else to say. We left the house in silence, walking side by side down the street. The air was crisp, and I could hear the crunch of the leaves beneath our feet as we made our way through the neighborhood. Neither of us spoke at first, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. About last night, he started, his voice a little uncertain. I don't want things to be weird between us. I stopped walking, turning to face him. I don't want things to be weird either, I said softly. But it's hard to just ignore what happened, Ethan. He nodded, his gaze meeting mine. I know. I've been trying to figure out how to act. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable around me, but I also don't know how to make it go away. The honesty in his words caught me off guard. He was just as uncertain as I was. For a moment, it felt like we were back to being the people we had been before, open, vulnerable, real. It was the first time in days I felt like I could breathe again. You don't have to figure everything out right away, I said, my voice gentle. I just need some time to process it. He smiled faintly, though his expression was still a little hesitant. I get it. We'll figure it out. No rush. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe we didn't have all the answers yet, but that was okay. We'd take it one step at a time. As we continued our walk, the awkwardness seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the familiar comfort of simply being together. Maybe, just maybe, things would go back to normal.